I was trapped in a disastrous dinner with someone who wouldn't stop talking about himself when I saw the emergency exit and took it. Outside in the rain, soaked and humiliated, I ducked into a quiet cafe. The owner handed me a towel and smiled, and something in that simple gesture made my heart stop. I didn't know that night would change everything. If you've ever found love when you least expected it, hit subscribe and let me know below. My name is Jared, and I'm 31 years old. I work as a residential energy auditor in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which means I spend my days crawling through attics and basements, checking insulation and ductwork, helping people understand where their homes are losing heat or cool air. It's quiet, methodical work, and I like it. I like the puzzle of it. The way every house has its own story to tell through the gaps in the walls and the drafts around the windows. I'd been single for about a year when my friend Kristen decided I needed to get back out there. She worked in my office as a scheduler, and she had a way of being persistent without being pushy. One afternoon in late September, she leaned against my cubicle and told me about someone she knew from her book club. His name was Vaughn, and according to Kristen, he was smart, funny, and recently single. She showed me a photo on her phone. He looked nice enough. Dark hair, good smile, well-dressed. I wasn't sure I was ready. My last relationship had ended quietly but painfully. His name was someone I won't mention here, and we'd been together for 3 years before realizing we wanted different things. He wanted to move to the coasts, chase bigger opportunities. I wanted to stay rooted here in Tulsa, close to my family, close to the life I'd built. We parted respectfully, but it still hurt. Still, Kristen's enthusiasm was hard to resist. She set up the date for a Saturday evening at a new Italian place downtown called Saviano's, just off Main Street near the Arts District. I agreed, partly because I trusted Kristen's judgment, and partly because I figured it was time to at least try. The night of the date, I dressed carefully. Not too formal, but not too casual either. Dark jeans, a button-down shirt, a jacket. I checked myself in the mirror and felt a flicker of nervousness. It had been a long time since I'd sat across from a stranger and tried to make a connection. Saviano's was busy when I arrived. The hostess led me to a table near the window, and I sat down, ordered a water, and waited. Vaughn showed up about 10 minutes later, and he looked just like his photo. He shook my hand firmly, smiled, and sat down. The first few minutes were fine. We ordered drinks, talked about the weather, exchanged the usual pleasantries. He asked what I did for work, and I explained the energy auditing. He nodded politely, then launched into a description of his own job. He was a director of business development for a tech startup, something involving data analytics and client acquisition. I listened. I asked questions. But as the appetizers arrived, I started to notice something. Vaughn didn't really pause. Every time I tried to share something about myself, he'd nod briefly and then pivot back to his own stories. His deals, his clients, his upcoming conference in Denver. He talked about his gym routine, his car, his recent vacation to Scottsdale. I tried to stay engaged. I told myself that maybe he was just nervous, that some people talk more when they're anxious. But as the entrees came and went, it became clear that this wasn't nerves. This was just how he was. He barely asked me a single follow-up question. When I mentioned that I'd grown up in Broken Arrow and still had family there, he said, "Cool," and then started talking about his own childhood in Texas. By the time dessert menus arrived, I felt exhausted. Not angry, just drained. I realized I'd spent the entire evening nodding and smiling while learning absolutely nothing about whether we had anything in common. I didn't even know if he liked books or music, or what he did on weekends beyond the gym. Then Vaughn excused himself to use the restroom, and I sat there alone at the table staring at my half-finished tiramisu. The restaurant felt too warm, too loud. I could hear laughter from the bar area, the clinking of glasses, the hum of conversation, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming need to leave. I know how that sounds. I know it was rude. But in that moment, I couldn't bear the thought of sitting through another 20 minutes of polite smiling while Vaughn talked about his startup's growth projections. I felt trapped, and I just needed air, so I did something I'm not proud of. I stood up, walked quickly to the hostess stand, and told her I wasn't feeling well. I handed her 2 20s to cover my half of the bill, apologized, and walked out the front door before Vaughn came back from the restroom. The cool September air hit my face, and I felt a rush of relief followed immediately by guilt. I pulled out my phone and texted Kristen, "I'm so sorry, I left. I'll explain later." Then I started walking. I didn't have a plan. I just walked down Main Street, past the closed storefronts and the little clusters of people outside bars. The night was clear, and the streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement. I turned down a side street, then another, trying to put distance between myself and Saviano's. That's when the rain started. It came suddenly, the way it sometimes does in Oklahoma. One moment the sky was clear, and the next, heavy drops were falling, soaking through my jacket. I didn't have an umbrella. I looked around for shelter and saw a small cafe on the corner, its windows glowing warm against the darkening street. The sign above the door said, "Treadwell's." I'd never noticed it before. I pushed open the door and stepped inside, dripping wet and feeling ridiculous. The cafe was small and quiet. There were only a few tables, most of them empty. The walls were painted a soft cream color, and there were bookshelves along one side, filled with mismatched volumes. Soft music played from somewhere, something jazzy and understated. It smelled like coffee and fresh bread. Behind the counter stood a man about my age, maybe a little older. He had light brown hair, a flannel shirt, and an easy, unhurried way of moving. He looked up when I came in, and his expression shifted from neutral to concerned. "Rough night?" he asked, and his voice was kind. I laughed, a short, embarrassed sound. "You could say that." He reached under the counter and pulled out a clean white towel. "Here," he said, handing it to me. "Dry off. Can I get you something? Coffee? Tea?" I took the towel gratefully and pressed it against my face, my hair. "Coffee would be great." "Thank you." He nodded and turned to the espresso machine. I sat down at one of the tables near the window and watched the rain streak down the glass. My phone buzzed. A text from Vaughn. "Where did you go? Are you okay?" I didn't answer. I didn't know what to say. I felt ashamed and relieved in equal measure. A few minutes later, the man from the counter brought over a ceramic mug filled with dark, fragrant coffee. He set it down gently in front of me. "On the house," he said. "You look like you need it." I looked up at him, and for the first time I really saw his face. He had kind eyes, hazel or green. I couldn't quite tell in the light. There was a scar on his chin, faint but visible. He had the sort of face that made you feel calm just looking at it. "Thank you," I said quietly. "I really appreciate it," he smiled. "No problem. I'm Forrest, by the way. I own this place." "Jared," I said, shaking his hand. His grip was warm and steady. Forrest went back behind the counter, and I sat there sipping my coffee, feeling the warmth spread through me. The rain continued outside, and I let myself relax into the stillness of the cafe. No one here wanted anything from me. No one was talking at me. It was just quiet and kind and safe. After a while, Forrest came back over with a plate. On it was a thick slice of banana bread, golden and fragrant. "I made this morning," he said. "You look like you could use it." I started to protest, but he waved me off. "Seriously, it's the end of the night. If you don't eat it, I'll just take it home and eat it myself, and I've already had 2 slices. I smiled despite myself. "Okay, thank you." He sat down across from me, and I didn't mind. "So," he said gently, "bad date?" I hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, really bad. I kind of ran away." Forrest didn't laugh or judge. He just nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes you have to. I've been there." We started talking, and it was so easy. He told me he'd opened Treadwell's about 3 years ago, after working for a decade as a wilderness search and rescue coordinator up in Colorado. He'd loved the work, he said, but it had taken a toll. Long hours, hard terrain, too many calls that didn't end well. He'd moved to Tulsa to be closer to his sister and decided to try something completely different. I wanted to create a space where people could just breathe, he said, somewhere quiet, somewhere that felt like a break from everything else. I told him about my work, about crawling through attics and finding places where the heat leaked out. He listened like he actually cared, asking real questions, nodding at the right moments. It felt like a conversation, not a performance. We talked for over an hour. The rain finally stopped, and the streetlights outside reflected in the puddles on the sidewalk. Forrest told me about the books on his shelves, how he'd collected them from estate sales and thrift stores over the years. I told him about my family in Broken Arrow, about my niece who was obsessed with dinosaurs. Eventually, I realized how late it was. I should let you close up, I said reluctantly. Forrest shrugged. No rush. But yeah, I should probably start cleaning. I stood, pulling on my damp jacket. Thank you, I said. Really. You didn't have to be this kind, he smiled. I wanted to. I walked to the door, then turned back. Can I come back sometime? I mean, during normal hours? Anytime, Forrest said. We're here every day except Monday. I stepped out into the cool night, and for the first time all evening I felt like I could breathe. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew I wanted to see him again. I went back to Treadwell's 3 days later, on a Tuesday afternoon. I told myself it was just because I liked the coffee, or because it was a nice, quiet place to sit. But I knew the truth. I wanted to see Forrest again. He was behind the counter when I walked in, pulling a tray of scones from the oven. He looked up and smiled when he saw me, and I felt something warm unfold in my chest. Hey, Jared, he said, like we were old friends. Welcome back. I ordered a coffee and a scone, and I sat at the same table by the window. Forrest brought my order over himself and sat down across from me for a few minutes. We talked about small things. The weather, a book he was reading, a job I had coming up in Bixby checking a century-old house for drafts. It became a pattern. I started going to Treadwell's 2 or 3 times a week, always in the late afternoon when the cafe was quiet. Forrest and I would talk, sometimes for just a few minutes, sometimes for an hour if he wasn't busy. I learned that he loved old folk music, that he'd grown up in Fort Collins, that he had a dog named Biscuit who stayed with his sister during the day. I started to notice little things about him. The way he hummed while he worked. The way he always remembered how I took my coffee. The way he listened, really listened when I talked. And I started to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. Something tentative and hopeful and a little bit terrifying. One afternoon in mid-October, I brought my laptop to Treadwell's and worked on some reports while sitting by the window. Forrest came over during a lull and sat down, bringing 2 mugs of tea. You've been here a lot lately, he said, and there was a question in his voice, gentle and curious. I looked up from my screen. Is that okay? Of course, he said quickly. I don't want you to feel like you have to keep buying coffee just to hang out. I smiled. I like it here. It's peaceful. Forrest looked at me for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. I like having you here, he said quietly. My heart did something complicated. Yeah. Yeah. We sat there in the warm light of the cafe, and I felt the air between us change, become charged with something unspoken. I wanted to reach across the table and take his hand. I wanted to tell him that I thought about him more than I should, that I looked forward to these afternoons more than anything else in my week. But I didn't. I wasn't sure if he felt the same way, and I didn't want to ruin what we had. A few days later, Forrest asked if I wanted to go for a walk. There's a trail along the Arkansas River, he said. It's pretty this time of year. If you're free this weekend. I said yes immediately. We met Saturday morning at the trailhead near Turkey Mountain. The air was crisp and cool, and the leaves were starting to turn gold and red. Forrest brought Biscuit, a cheerful mutt with floppy ears and a wagging tail. We walked for over 2 hours, talking and laughing. Forrest told me stories from his search and rescue days, about long nights on the mountain and the satisfaction of bringing someone home safely. I told him about the strangest houses I'd audited, including one in Owasso, where the homeowner had built an entire indoor greenhouse in the attic. At one point, Biscuit ran ahead, chasing a squirrel, and Forrest and I stood on an overlook, looking out at the river below. The sunlight glinted off the water, and the city skyline rose in the distance. "This is nice," Forrest said. "I don't get out here as much as I should." "Me neither," I admitted. "I spend so much time in other people's houses that I forget to just be outside." Forrest turned to look at me, and his expression was serious, almost vulnerable. "I'm really glad you walked into my cafe that night." "Me too," I said softly. He reached out and took my hand. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was just natural, like it was something we'd been building toward all along. His hand was warm and rough from work, and it fit perfectly in mine. We stood there for a while, holding hands, not saying anything. Then Biscuit came bounding back, and we laughed and kept walking. That evening, Forrest invited me to his place for dinner. He lived in a small bungalow in the Riverview neighborhood, just north of downtown. The house was old but well kept, with hardwood floors and big windows. It smelled like garlic and rosemary when I arrived. Forrest cooked pasta with roasted vegetables, and we ate at his kitchen table, talking and laughing. After dinner, we sat on his couch and he put on a record, something soft and acoustic. Biscuit curled up at our feet. "I need to tell you something," Forrest said after a while, his voice quiet. I looked at him, my heart beating a little faster. "Okay, I really like you, Jared," he said. "And I don't want to assume anything, but I feel like maybe you feel the same way." I smiled, relief flooding through me. "I do. I really do." He leaned in and we kissed. It was gentle and unhurried, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. When we pulled apart, Forrest was smiling, and I felt like I was glowing from the inside out. We spent the rest of the evening curled up together on the couch, talking about everything and nothing. At some point, I fell asleep with my head on his shoulder. And when I woke up, the record had stopped playing and the room was dark except for the light from the kitchen. Forrest was awake, watching me with a soft expression. "Hey," he said quietly. "Hey," I murmured. "Sorry, I didn't mean to fall asleep." "Don't be sorry," he said. I liked it. I stayed the night, and we spent the next morning making breakfast together, moving around his kitchen like we'd been doing it for years. Over the next few weeks, we fell into an easy rhythm. I'd stop by Treadwell's after work, and we'd talk while Forrest cleaned up and closed the cafe. On weekends, we'd explore Tulsa together, the Gathering Place, Woodward Park, the little neighborhood streets in Maple Ridge and Tracy Park. Forrest introduced me to his sister Janine, who lived in Midtown with her husband and 2 kids. She was warm and funny, and she clearly adored Forrest. She pulled me aside at one point and said, "I haven't seen him this happy in years." I met his friends, a small group of people who'd known him since he moved to Tulsa. They welcomed me easily, and I felt like I was being folded into a life that was warm and full and generous. I introduced Forrest to my family at a Sunday dinner in Broken Arrow. My mom loved him immediately. My dad, who was usually reserved, spent an hour talking to Forrest about hiking and the mountains of Colorado. My niece, the dinosaur enthusiast, decided Forrest was her new favorite person when he started asking her detailed questions about Triceratops. Everything felt easy, natural, right. But there was something I hadn't told Forrest yet, something that was starting to weigh on me. About a month into our relationship, I got a call from my boss. The company was expanding, opening a new office in Fayetteville, Arkansas, and they wanted me to lead the team there. It was a promotion, a significant raise, and a chance to do more advanced work. It was everything I'd been working toward, but it would mean leaving Tulsa. I didn't say yes right away. I asked for time to think about it, but the weight of the decision sat heavy in my chest. I didn't tell Forrest at first. I told myself I was waiting until I'd made up my mind. But the truth was I was scared. Scared of what it might mean. Scared of how he'd react. One evening in late November, we were at his house cooking dinner together. Forrest was chopping vegetables, humming along to the music playing from his phone, and I was stirring a pot of soup on the stove. It was so domestic, so comfortable, and I felt a rush of affection for him so strong it nearly knocked me over. "Forrest," I said, and my voice came out strange. He looked up. "Yeah?" I set down the spoon. "I need to tell you something." His expression shifted, becoming cautious. "Okay," I told him about the job offer. About Fayetteville, about the promotion, about the fact that I hadn't made a decision yet, but that I was running out of time. Forrest set down the knife. He was quiet for a long moment, and I couldn't read his face. "When do you have to decide?" he asked finally. "By the end of the week." He nodded slowly. "Do you want to go?" I hesitated. "I don't know. It's a great opportunity. But it would mean leaving? Everything." "Leaving me," Forrest said quietly. "Yes." He looked at me, and his eyes were sad but not angry. "I don't want you to turn it down because of me, Jared. That's not fair." "But I don't want to lose you," I said, and my voice cracked. Forrest came around the counter and took my hands. "You won't lose me," he said. "Fayetteville's not that far. We could make it work, could we?" I asked. "Really?" He kissed me gently. "I think so, if we both want to." We talked for hours that night, weighing the options, talking through what long distance might look like. Forrest was calm and steady, the way he always was, and he helped me see things more clearly. But by the end of the night, I still hadn't decided. I spent the next few days thinking. I made lists. I talked to my mom. I went for long drives through Tulsa, looking at the familiar streets and trying to imagine leaving them. On Thursday evening, I went to Treadwell's. Forrest was behind the counter, serving a couple of customers. When he saw me, he smiled, but there was a question in his eyes. I waited until the customers left, and then I walked up to the counter. "I'm not going," I said. Forrest blinked. "What?" "I'm not taking the job," I said. "I'm staying in Tulsa." He came around the counter quickly. "Jared, are you sure?" "I don't want you to—" "I'm sure," I said. I thought about it a lot. And the truth is I don't want to leave. Not the city, not my family, and not you. This is where I want to be. Forrest looked at me for a long moment, and then he pulled me into a tight hug. "Okay," he said softly. "Okay." I called my boss the next morning and told him I was declining the offer. He was disappointed but understanding, and he assured me there would be other opportunities down the line. And the moment I hung up the phone, I felt nothing but relief. Forrest and I spent the holidays together. Thanksgiving with my family in Broken Arrow. Christmas Eve at his sister's house in Midtown. New Year's Eve at Treadwell's, just the two of us, drinking champagne and watching the quiet street outside. As winter turned into spring, we talked about the future. About moving in together. About what came next. One afternoon in March, Forrest closed the cafe early and took me to Turkey Mountain again. We hiked to the same overlook where we'd held hands for the first time, and we stood there looking out at the river. "I've been thinking," Forrest said. "About what?" "About us. About how much my life has changed since you walked into the cafe that night." I smiled. "Mine too." He turned to face me, and he was smiling, but also serious. "I know it's only been a few months, but I feel like I've known you forever, and I don't want to imagine my life without you in it." My heart was pounding. "Forrest, I'm not saying we have to rush anything," he said quickly, "but I want you to know that I'm in this. For the long haul. If you are." I reached out and took his hand. "I am. Completely." He kissed me, soft and sure, and I felt the future open up in front of us, wide and full of possibility. That summer, I moved into Forrest's bungalow in Riverview. We painted the bedroom together, hung pictures on the walls, filled the house with books and music and life. Biscuit adjusted immediately, claiming the spot at the foot of the bed as his own. Forrest expanded Treadwell's, adding a small patio out back where people could sit under string lights and drink coffee in the evenings. I helped him build the tables using skills I'd learned from my dad. It felt good to make something together, to watch the cafe grow into an even warmer, more welcoming space. My job stayed steady. I took on more complex projects, older homes with tricky layouts and hidden problems. I liked the challenge. And I liked coming home at the end of the day to Forrest, to the smell of whatever he was cooking, to the sound of his voice calling out a greeting from the kitchen. We settled into a life that felt both extraordinary and beautifully ordinary. Weekend hikes, dinners with friends, quiet evenings on the couch, trips to visit his family in Colorado and mine in Broken Arrow. I thought sometimes about that night at Saviano's, about walking out into the rain and stumbling into Treadwell's by accident. I thought about how close I'd come to missing this entirely. One evening in late summer, Forrest and I were sitting on the back patio of the cafe after closing. The string lights glowed overhead, and the air was warm and thick with the smell of honeysuckle. Biscuit was asleep under the table. "Do you ever think about that first night?" I asked. Forrest smiled. "All the time. I was such a mess," I said, laughing. "Soaking wet, running away from a bad date." "You were perfect," Forrest said. "You looked like you needed kindness, and I wanted to give it to you." I reached across the table and took his hand. "You did. You still do." He squeezed my hand gently. "So do you." We sat there in the warm night, holding hands, surrounded by the life we'd built together. And I felt a kind of peace I'd never known before. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of something solid and true. I'd spent so long thinking love had to be complicated, dramatic, hard-won. But this was easy. Not effortless, but easy in the way that mattered. We showed up for each other. We listened. We made space for each other's lives and dreams. That fall, Forrest and I started talking seriously about marriage. Not in a rushed way, but in a way that felt natural, like we were simply naming something that already existed. One October evening, almost a year to the day after we'd met, Forrest proposed. We were back at Turkey Mountain at the same Overlook, and the sun was setting over the river, turning the water gold and pink. He didn't get down on one knee or make a big speech. He just took my hand and said, "I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" I said yes before he'd even finished the question. We got married the following spring, in a small ceremony at Woodward Park. My family was there, and his, and our friends. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt, and when we kissed, everyone cheered. We honeymooned in Colorado, hiking through the mountains Forrest had once worked in, sleeping under the stars, talking about the life we wanted to build together. When we came back to Tulsa, we came back to the bungalow in Riverview, to Treadwell's, to the routines and rhythms we loved, but everything felt richer now, deeper, more intentional. I still work as an energy auditor. Forrest still runs the cafe. We still hike on weekends and have dinner with family and sit on the back patio in the evenings, talking and laughing. But now we do it as husbands, as partners, as two people who found each other on a